I am Declan, 32 years old. 2 months ago, I was sitting in my father's mahogany-paneled study, the very room where I had spent my entire childhood desperately trying to earn his respect. My parents looked me dead in the eye and told me the absolute greatest gift I could give my golden child brother for his high society wedding was to disappear from our family completely. In a time when they should have been proud of me, my own mother looked at me with a gaze so cold it could freeze boiling water, and she said, "The greatest gift would be if you weren't there, if you just disappeared." They literally wanted to erase my existence so they could play the perfect, flawless family in front of a crowd of 300 elite guests. But there is one massive, ruinous detail they did not know. The joint family investment account they were heavily counting on to finance this massive six-figure wedding extravaganza was actually 80% my money. And right now, as they face the utter collapse of their social standing and a potential lawsuit from the wedding vendors, they are desperately begging for my help. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their fake empire brick by brick, hit that like button if you believe in absolute justice. And do not forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let's go back to the moment the illusion finally shattered. The heavy oak door of my childhood home closed behind me with a solid, echoing thud. It sounded like a final punctuation mark at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. I did not slam it. I did not yell. I did not throw a tantrum. I just walked out into the cool evening air, holding my car keys so tightly the jagged metal edges dug deep into my palm. I walked down the pristine, perfectly manicured stone pathway of their suburban Massachusetts estate. Everything about that house was designed to project an image of undeniable wealth and perfect familial harmony. The perfectly trimmed hedges, the warm glow of the porch lights, the matching wreaths on the double front doors. It was a beautiful, hollow shell. I got into my car, gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white, and drove away. I did not turn on the radio. I just listened to the hum of the engine and the sound of my own breathing. For 32 years, I had twisted myself into a pretzel trying to earn my place in that house. I had achieved everything a parent could possibly want. I had a phenomenal career as a cybersecurity architect, a flawless record, and a deep respect for my family name. But that night, the illusion shattered entirely. I finally understood that I was never going to be good enough. I was never going to be the son they wanted to show off. I was the dark secret they wanted to sweep under the rug before the billionaires arrived. The drive back to my luxury condo in downtown Boston took 45 minutes, but it felt like 5 seconds. My mind was racing, replaying every single word they had said in that study. By the time I pulled into my underground parking garage, a profound shift had occurred inside my head. The emotional bleeding had stopped. In its place was a cold, calculated focus. The kind of focus you get when you realize you have been fighting a war for people who are actively shooting you in the back. The very next morning, I woke up with a clarity I had never felt before. The lingering fog of guilt, the desperate need for parental approval, the constant second-guessing of my own worth. It was all completely gone. I walked into my high-end kitchen, poured a cup of black coffee, and picked up my phone. I called Diana, my real estate agent. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman who knew the Boston market better than anyone. Diana picked up on the second ring. I did not waste time with small talk. I told her to list my condo immediately. I wanted a quick, aggressive cash sale. Diana was completely taken aback. She stammered, asking if I was facing some sort of sudden bankruptcy, a messy divorce, or a massive lawsuit. She knew how much I loved this place. I had spent a fortune customizing the layout, installing top-tier smart home security, and upgrading the finishes. She reminded me that we were heading into a slightly slower market season and a rushed sale might cost me some equity. I firmly told her that the equity did not matter right now. I simply told her it was time for a fresh start. I needed to liquidate my assets and I needed it done yesterday. I told her I would accept the first reasonable cash offer that could close in under 30 days. After hanging up with Diana, I sat down at my massive kitchen island, opened my laptop, and logged into the joint family investment portfolio. Years ago, when I first started making real money in the tech sector, My parents set this up as a shared pool of wealth. They pitched it as a safety net, a legacy we were all building together. They always talked about it like it was some grand inheritance they were building for my brother Silas and me. They made it sound like a beautiful family trust. The reality was entirely different. Over the last 5 years, my career had skyrocketed. I built proprietary security algorithms for massive tech firms. I earned a massive salary, pulled in massive annual bonuses, and I had consistently pumped $326,000 of my own hard-earned money into that joint account. I did it because I wanted to help it grow. I did it because I was desperately trying to prove my financial worth to a father who worshipped money and status above all else. I thought if I could secure our family's financial future, he would finally look at me with pride. I thought he would finally view me as a peer instead of a disappointment. I opened the transaction history tab. I reviewed every single deposit I had made over the last 60 months. With a few precise, deliberate clicks, I initiated a massive wire transfer to my private offshore account. I withdrew my exact documented contributions, plus the exact accrued capital gains those specific funds had generated. I left my parents' original seed money and Silas's meager contributions completely untouched. I was not a thief. I was not going to give them any ammunition to claim I robbed them or breached any fiduciary duty. I was simply reclaiming my own life, down to the absolute last red cent, watching the screen refresh and seeing the portfolio balance plummet from nearly $400,000 down to a pathetic fraction of that amount felt like severing an infected limb. The poison was finally leaving my body. I knew they were relying on that massive balance to pay the final catering bills, the floral arrangements, and the venue fees for Silas's wedding. I knew they had not checked the balance in weeks because they trusted me to manage it. I sat back in my chair and looked around my expensive, perfectly staged apartment. The minimalist furniture, the high-end artwork, the imported Italian leather sofa. Everything I had bought was subconsciously chosen to impress my mother, Cynthia. She was a woman who judged human worth strictly by zip codes, square footage, and the brand names printed on the inside of a collar. My father, Gregory, was a ruthless corporate lawyer. He only respected people who possessed the power to destroy others in a courtroom or buy them out in a boardroom. I had spent my entire adult life trying to build a resume they could brag about at their suffocating HOA meetings or their elite country club dinners. As I watched the morning sunlight crawl across the dark hardwood floor, the absolute silence of the empty apartment pressed in on me. I realized that my departure last night was not a sudden explosion of anger. It was a slow burn. It was a death by 1,000 cuts that started 2 decades ago. The wound had been bleeding for a very long time. I just finally decided to stop applying bandages. I thought the worst was over now that the money was moved and the property was being listed. I thought the separation was clean and the message was delivered. I was so incredibly wrong. The real storm had not even started to brew. Growing up in our household was exactly like living in a relentless corporate performance review where the metrics were constantly, deliberately rigged against me. Silas was 4 years younger than me, and from the absolute moment he could walk, he was the indisputable golden child. He had my mother's charming, camera-ready smile and my father's uncanny knack for smooth-talking his way out of any trouble. I was the quiet, analytical one. I preferred reading thick technical manuals over networking. I preferred building computers from scratch over shaking hands at my father's endless cocktail parties. I clearly remember being 12 years old and bringing home a perfect report card. I had straight A's in advanced math, physics, and literature. I proudly placed it on the granite counter while my father was reviewing a massive legal brief for a corporate merger. I waited for him to look up. He barely glanced over the top of his reading glasses, muttered that it was exactly what he expected from me, and went right back to his paperwork. There was no smile. There was no pat on the back. It was treated as a basic baseline requirement for existing in his house. 2 days later, Silas brought home a B- in basic middle school algebra. My parents acted like he had just discovered a cure for a rare disease. They threw a massive celebration dinner at the most expensive steakhouse in the city. I remember the smell of roasted garlic and the clinking of the crystal glasses. My mother stood up, tapped her silver knife against her wine glass, and announced to the entire table that Silas worked so incredibly hard and his sheer determination needed to be deeply rewarded. I sat at the far end of the table, cutting my steak in absolute silence, swallowing the bitter, metallic taste of being entirely invisible in my own family. The disparities only grew worse as we got older. Science fairs became my personal battlefield for attention. I thought if I built something incredible, they would have to see me. In 8th grade, I spent 3 agonizing months building a fully functional, small-scale solar power generator. I wired the panels myself. I soldered the circuit boards. I won first place in the regional competition. My father skipped the awards ceremony entirely. He said he could not miss Silas's middle school soccer game. He told me that my project was interesting, but sports built character and team spirit. My massive, gold-plated first-place trophy sat in a cardboard box in my closet because my mother explicitly said it clashed with the aesthetic of her carefully curated living room decor. When it came time for college, the financial manipulation became glaringly obvious. Despite having a hefty college fund that my grandparents had originally seeded, my parents complained endlessly about the rising cost of higher education. They talked about 401k adjustments, tightening belts, and the burden of tuition. Taking the hint, I busted my back, studied until my eyes bled, scored perfectly on my SATs, and took a full-ride scholarship to a state university for computer science. I saved them tens of thousands of dollars. I thought they would be proud of my financial responsibility. Did they thank me? Absolutely not. My father told his law firm partners that I lacked the ambition to aim for an Ivy League. He called my choice practical but thoroughly uninspired. 3 years later, Silas decided he wanted to study liberal arts at a private, wildly expensive college with mediocre academic rankings but a massive social prestige factor. My parents did not blink. They drained the remaining college fund, took out substantial Parent Plus loans, and praised him endlessly for following his passion and networking with the right demographic. They treated his overpriced, essentially useless degree like a badge of absolute honor, while they treated my practical, debt-free, highly technical education like a dirty family secret. After graduation, my trajectory shot upward. I secured a lucrative position in a top-tier cybersecurity firm. By the time I was 28, I got a massive promotion, a senior architect title, a 6-figure salary, and I bought my luxury condo in Back Bay. I was completely, undeniably financially independent. I thought maybe, just maybe, this undeniable level of material success would finally earn me a legitimate seat at the table. I invited them over for Thanksgiving dinner one year to celebrate my new home. I spent 2 days cooking a full, traditional spread. I wanted everything to be perfect. My mother walked through the front door, immediately ran her index finger over the kitchen counter checking for dust, and loudly proclaimed that it was a cute little bachelor pad. My father sat down, looked at my dual-monitor work set up in the corner, and asked if I ever planned on getting a real job that required wearing a suit. He implied that working with computers was essentially glorified tech support for people who actually ran the world. They spent the entire Thanksgiving dinner talking about Silas's new entry-level marketing job, his new apartment they were subsidizing, and how he was rubbing shoulders with future executives. I realized then, staring at the carved turkey and the crystal wine glasses, that it did not matter how much money I made. It did not matter that I had zero debt while Silas frequently needed them to cover his credit card bills. In their eyes, I was a grease monkey in a digital world, and Silas was pure royalty destined for greatness. The ultimate breaking point, the catastrophic catalyst that set my world completely on fire, arrived when Silas hit the absolute jackpot. He started dating Victoria Harrison. The Harrisons were not just rich. They were generational, filthy, untouchable, private jet rich. Victoria's father, Harrison, owned a global chain of ultra-luxury boutique hotels. He was a titan of industry. When Silas announced the engagement, my parents went into a state of absolute, feverish hysteria. This was their golden ticket. This was the ultimate social elevation my mother had prayed for since she first started selling real estate. They were about to marry into a billionaire dynasty. Suddenly, the family dynamic shifted from quiet, passive neglect to active, aggressive management. They needed our family to look utterly flawless. They needed to project an image of old money and impeccable breeding. And in their perfectly curated country club vision of the future, I was a glaring, unacceptable flaw that needed to be scrubbed out. But they had absolutely no idea just how much power I actually held behind the scenes, and how quickly their house of cards was about to collapse. The engagement party was hosted at the Harrison estate, a sprawling, gated mansion outside the city that made my parents' affluent suburban home look like a dilapidated tool shed. I arrived in my standard, charcoal gray tailored suit, actively trying to keep a low profile and just get through the night without causing a scene. That was the first time I saw the stunning, immaculate white Rolls-Royce parked in the circular stone driveway. The sheer opulence of the event was suffocating. Waiters in white gloves circulated with trays of vintage champagne and caviar. Mr. Harrison stepped out onto the grand terrace, looking every bit the billionaire titan he was. He had a commanding presence, the kind of aura that made people instantly quiet down. My parents practically broke their necks trying to fawn over him. Gregory, the fierce, intimidating courtroom lawyer, was suddenly nodding along to everything Mr. Harrison said like a subservient, desperate intern begging for a crumb of approval. During the cocktail hour, something unexpected happened. Mr. Harrison actually approached me at the bar. He had a firm, bone-crushing handshake and sharp, calculating eyes that seemed to read right through people. He asked what I did for a living. I stood up straight and told him I was a lead architect in enterprise cybersecurity, specializing in threat mitigation for large-scale corporate networks. For a split second, a spark of genuine, professional interest crossed his face. He opened his mouth to ask a follow-up question. But before we could get into a real conversation, my mother materialized out of nowhere like a panic-stricken ghost. She grabbed my arm, her nails digging painfully into my bicep through my suit jacket, and laughed a high-pitched, incredibly nervous laugh. She told Mr. Harrison that I was just the family's little computer guy, always tinkering with gadgets, and she quickly, forcefully steered the conversation back to Silas and Victoria's upcoming trip to Milan. I saw the immediate dismissal register in Mr. Harrison's eyes as he politely nodded and walked away. My mother shot me a glare that could melt steel. That night kicked off the most deeply insulting month of my entire life. My parents decided I needed a total top-to-bottom overhaul before the wedding. My mother bombarded me with daily texts demanding I change my haircut to something more traditional. My father called me at work to tell me my reliable sedan was a complete embarrassment to the family image and heavily suggested I lease a Porsche or a Mercedes just for the wedding week so I wouldn't look like the poor relative pulling up to the valet. Then came the dinner with Preston. Preston was Victoria's cousin, a snide, arrogant, trust fund brat who drove a bright red Porsche, wore loafers without socks, and spoke to service workers like they were stray dogs. At a massive family brunch intended to blend the two families, Preston sat directly across from me, swirling his expensive mimosa. He loudly, with a smirk plastered on his face, asked if I could come over to his penthouse to fix his broken laptop keyboard. He offered to pay me $100 for my trouble. My Aunt Beatrice, the family gossip who fed entirely on drama and misery, chimed in immediately. She laughed and said it was simply wonderful that I had a little technical trade to fall back on, unlike the high-level executives at the table. My parents just sat there. They sipped their drinks and smiled their tight, fake smiles. They let this arrogant kid completely humiliate my decade of hard work and expertise because defending me would mean challenging the almighty Harrison bloodline. I swallowed the burning anger in my throat. I kept my mouth firmly shut. I told myself I was doing it for Silas. I was absorbing the blows so his big day wouldn't be ruined by a family feud. But Silas was entirely absorbed in his new, shiny life. He was busy trying on custom Italian tuxedos, touring European honeymoon destinations, and ignoring my existence completely. The ultimate, unforgivable betrayal happened exactly 4 weeks before the wedding. My parents invited me over for a private, immediate family dinner. The atmosphere in the house was incredibly tense, thick enough to cut with a knife. After the plates were cleared, Gregory asked me to step into his study. Cynthia followed closely behind, shutting the heavy oak doors and locking us in. My father stood by the window, staring out at the dark lawn, flatly refusing to look at me. He cleared his throat and said the Harrisons had some very traditional, extremely elite guests coming to the wedding. Former governors, Fortune 500 CEOs, people who noticed when things were out of place, people who expected a certain pedigree. I crossed my arms and asked him to get straight to the point. My mother stepped forward. Her voice was steady, calculated, and completely devoid of any maternal warmth. She told me that my presence was becoming a logistical nightmare. She said I didn't quite fit the image they needed to project. My career wasn't prestigious enough to brag about. My demeanor was too rigid. My refusal to play the social climbing game was making them look bad. "We are asking you to sit this one out, Declan," my father said, finally turning to face me. I stared at them, my brain struggling to process the sheer audacity of the words. I asked if they were seriously, genuinely uninviting me from my only brother's wedding. My mother looked me dead in the eye, her expression completely flat. "The greatest gift would be if you weren't there. If you could disappear from our family gathering, just for that day, it would make things so much easier for everyone. We can't risk you embarrassing us in front of the Harrisons." They did not want me there. They were profoundly ashamed of me. I did not scream. I did not flip the heavy mahogany desk. I did not cry. Instead, I felt a cold, hard, impenetrable knot form in the dead center of my chest. All the years of trying to buy their love, all the late nights working to prove my worth, all the financial contributions I made to secure their future. It all evaporated in a single freezing second. I looked at the two people who brought me into this world and realized they were nothing more than strangers wearing familiar faces. They were parasites feeding on my loyalty. "Understood," I said. My voice was dangerously calm. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy brass spare key to their house that I had faithfully carried on my keychain since I was 18 years old, and dropped it onto the leather desk blotter. It landed with a heavy thud. "Declan, do not be dramatic about this," my mother sighed, rolling her eyes as if I were a toddler throwing a tantrum. "This isn't a permanent exile. It is just one day for your brother." "No," I replied, turning my back on them and reaching for the brass door handle. "It is forever." I walked out. I walked down the hallway, out the front door, and into the night. I left them standing there in their beautiful, expensive study, completely unaware of the massive financial and social hurricane that was about to hit their perfectly constructed lives. The silence that followed my abrupt departure was absolute and deafening. My parents did not call me to apologize. Silas did not send a single text message to ask what happened or why I wasn't at the final suit fittings. They were perfectly, gleefully content with my absence. They assumed I would just crawl back into my lonely little corner, lick my wounds, and stay completely out of their way until they decided to summon me back for the holidays. They drastically, fundamentally underestimated my capacity for total emotional detachment. Within 2 weeks of that dinner, Diana called me with massive news. She had secured a frantic cash buyer for my condo. The real estate market in downtown Boston was absolutely on fire, and the buyer was a corporate executive willing to pay well over the asking price to close the deal in 10 days. I agreed immediately. I spent 3 days packing my entire life into a dozen cardboard boxes. I threw out every single gift my parents had ever given me. I threw out the framed photos of fake family vacations. I stripped my life down to the absolute essentials. I was preparing to leave the East Coast entirely. The massive withdrawal of my $326,000 from the joint investment account went completely unnoticed by my parents for the first 10 days. They were too busy coordinating imported floral arrangements, booking private string quartets, and finalizing the menus for the rehearsal dinner. But the clock was ticking, and I knew the final, exorbitant payments for the wedding venues and caterers were due very soon. They were going to try to pull from that account, and they were going to hit a brick wall of insufficient funds. During my final days in the city, trying to finalize my moving logistics, I ran into Felix at a local coffee shop. Felix was my cousin, the son of the perpetually toxic Aunt Beatrice. He had always played the middleman in our family, pretending to be the sympathetic ear, the guy you could vent to when the parents were being unreasonable. We sat down at a small corner table, and Felix leaned in, putting on his absolute best sad, empathetic face. He said he had heard about the wedding drama and told me how incredibly unfair it all was. He patted my shoulder, shook his head, and told me I was so much better off without their toxic energy weighing me down. I actually believed him for a second. I thought, finally, someone in this bloodline sees the truth. I got up to grab some extra napkins from the counter. When I walked back to the table, Felix was typing frantically on his phone, completely absorbed in the screen. He didn't hear my footsteps approach. I stood directly behind him and glanced over his shoulder. He was texting my mother. The message on the screen made my blood run cold. It read, "Just bumped into Declan at the cafe. He looks like a total mess. He's completely unstable right now. You were absolutely right to keep him away from the Harrisons. Total liability." A wave of pure, unfiltered disgust washed over me. The rot ran deep. The entire family was infected with the same disease of gossip, backstabbing, and social climbing. I didn't confront him. I didn't cause a scene or flip his coffee into his lap. I just turned around on my heel, walked right out the side door of the coffee shop, and left Felix sitting there waiting for a guy who was never coming back. Sitting in my car in the parking lot, I pulled out my phone and did the most liberating, incredible thing I have ever done in my entire life. I blocked Felix's number. Then I went to Aunt Beatrice's contact and blocked her. I blocked Gregory. I blocked Cynthia. I blocked Silas. I went into my social media settings and systematically erased every single member of my bloodline from my digital life. I deleted their emails. I removed myself from the shared family calendars. I was no longer angry. Anger implies you still care. I was simply surgically removing a massive tumor. The week of the wedding finally arrived. Boston was buzzing with high society gossip about the grand Harrison-Montgomery union. It was going to be the event of the season, but I wasn't there to see it. I had loaded my boxes into my car and driven 4 hours north, deep into the dense, isolated woods of Vermont. I had rented a small, secluded cabin with zero cell reception, a wood-burning stove, and absolute silence. While they were stressing over seating charts and napkin rings, I chopped firewood. I hiked up steep trails until my lungs burned. I breathed air that didn't smell like expensive, suffocating perfume and endless deceit. On the late afternoon of the wedding day, I was sitting on the wooden porch of the cabin, looking out over the endless sea of pine trees, when a car crunched up the long dirt gravel driveway. I stood up, tense, but relaxed when I saw who stepped out. It was Julian. Julian was my best friend, a brilliant tech entrepreneur who knew every single dark, twisted corner of my family history. He had fought in the trenches with me during our college days. He stepped out of his car carrying a massive cooler full of local craft beer and a very grim, knowing smile on his face. "I figured you shouldn't be sitting alone in the woods on a day like today," Julian said, walking up the steps and tossing me an ice-cold bottle. We sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the sun slowly dip below the jagged tree line, painting the sky in deep shades of purple and orange. Down in Boston, the extravagant wedding reception was in full swing. My parents were undoubtedly sipping expensive champagne, schmoozing with politicians and CEOs, basking in the artificial glow of their fake perfection. "You want to know what's happening down there right now?" Julian asked quietly, breaking the silence. I took a slow sip of my beer, stared out at the trees, and looked at him. "I don't care, Julian. They're dead to me." Julian smirked, pulling his phone out of his jacket pocket and tapping the screen. "Oh, you're going to care about this, Declan, because your parents just walked directly into a massive landmine in front of the entire city's elite. And the explosion, man, the explosion is absolutely spectacular." I leaned forward, the bottle cold against my hand. The storm I had quietly, meticulously set in motion was finally making landfall. The Vermont woods were completely pitch black, the kind of absolute darkness you never get to experience when you live in a major metropolitan area like Boston. The only source of light on the wooden porch of my rented cabin came from a single, flickering yellow bulb above the door and the faint, glowing embers of the fire pit I had built earlier in the afternoon. I was sitting in a heavy Adirondack chair, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, watching my best friend Julian pull another local craft beer from his massive plastic cooler. Julian had driven 4 hours straight up the highway just to make sure I did not spend the night of my brother's wedding staring at the wall and spiraling into a dark place. He knew my family history better than anyone else on the planet. He knew the exact psychological warfare my parents, Gregory and Cynthia, had waged against me for 3 decades. And most importantly, he knew I had just pulled the financial rug right out from under their meticulously planned, 6-figure high society event. Julian cracked the cap off the glass bottle, handed it to me, and leaned back in his own creaky wooden chair. He took a long, slow pull from his drink, letting the suspense build in the freezing night air. His eyes were practically dancing in the dim light. He had the kind of chaotic, electric energy that only comes from witnessing a spectacular, unmitigated disaster firsthand. I had spent the last few weeks aggressively purging my toxic family from my mind, burying the deep, lingering hurt under thick layers of logical detachment and professional focus. But in that specific moment, sitting in the absolute quiet of the deep woods, surrounded by nothing but towering pine trees and cold wind, I let myself listen. I needed to know exactly how the meticulously constructed house of cards had finally collapsed. I needed to know if they got away with it, or if the universe finally delivered the justice I had been starving for since I was a child. "So," Julian began, his voice cutting sharply through the evening silence, echoing slightly against the wooden logs of the cabin. The reception was held in the grand ballroom of the Harrison Flagship Luxury Hotel, right in the heart of downtown Boston. We are not talking about a nice, upper-middle-class country club dinner, Declan. We are talking about crystal chandeliers the size of minivans hanging from vaulted, hand-painted ceilings. We are talking about imported white orchids covering every single inch of the tables, a 12-piece live classical orchestra playing softly in the corner, and a guest list that looked like a Forbes 500 summit mixed with a high-level political convention. Your parents were in absolute, pure heaven. They had finally made it to the mountaintop they had been climbing their entire lives. I nodded slowly, gripping the cold neck of my beer bottle, easily picturing the exact suffocating scene. It was everything they had ever wanted. A room full of wealth, power, and untouchable prestige. "Tell me about them," I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of any real sympathy or warmth. "Tell me exactly how they acted. Your mother, Cynthia, was wearing a custom designer gown that probably cost more than a 20% down payment on a standard house," Julian said, shaking his head in disbelief. "She was floating around the ballroom like she owned the entire global hotel chain, acting like she had been born into this level of generational wealth. She was schmoozing with the elite, sipping vintage champagne, and laughing that high-pitched, fake laugh she does when she is trying to impress people with a higher net worth. Your father, Gregory, was working the room like a starving shark in a fish tank. He was handing out his heavy, embossed cardstock business cards to state politicians, real estate tycoons, and hedge fund managers. He was desperately trying to leverage this wedding to secure some massive corporate retainer for his law firm. He looked so incredibly smug, Declan. He looked like a man who believed he had outsmarted the entire world." I took a slow sip of my beer, the bitter hops burning the back of my throat. "And what about Silas?" I asked. "How was the golden child handling his big debut into the Billionaire Boys Club?" Silas looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a very expensive, very fast freight train, Julian said, letting out a dry, humorless chuckle. He was sweating right through his custom-tailored Italian tuxedo. He looked pale and completely overwhelmed. He kept looking over his shoulder like he expected the police to walk in and arrest him for fraud. But here is where it gets incredibly interesting, Declan, because people started asking questions. You see, when you host a high-society wedding with 300 elite guests, people expect to see the immediate family sitting front and center. It is a matter of protocol and respect. And your absence was glaringly obvious. It was a massive, gaping hole at the head table, The empty mahogany chair next to your Aunt Beatrice was practically glowing in the dark. Julian reached into his heavy winter jacket pocket, pulled out his smartphone, and started scrolling through a digital notepad application. I knew you would want all the details, so I actually wrote down the exact lies your parents were telling people. It was an absolute masterclass in panic, improvisation, and narcissistic delusion. First, I overheard your mother cornering the governor's wife by the massive, glowing champagne tower. Cynthia leaned in and practically whispered that you were on a highly classified, incredibly vital business trip in Tokyo for a major international tech conglomerate and couldn't get a private flight back to the States in time. The governor's wife looked impressed, which just fed Cynthia's ego even more. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed out into the dark, silent woods. Of course she did. That is classic Cynthia Montgomery. The smear campaign mixed with delusions of grandeur. If they cannot control you, they try to completely control how other people see you. They had to make my absence sound either incredibly prestigious or deeply tragic. They couldn't just admit they uninvited their own flesh and blood to save face. Exactly, Julian agreed, his smile widening into a full, satisfied grin. 10 minutes later, I walked past the Mahogany Cigar Lounge and heard your father telling a group of senior corporate lawyers that you had come down with a severe, sudden case of pneumonia and were strictly quarantined in a private hospital wing. He even acted like he was holding back tears. He played the role of the concerned, heartbroken patriarch perfectly. By the time the seared scallop appetizers were being served, your Aunt Beatrice was wandering around the room, whispering to anyone who would listen that you had suffered a minor nervous breakdown because you were insanely jealous of Silas's success and simply couldn't handle seeing him marry into the prestigious Harrison family. I shook my head, feeling a wave of pure disgust wash over me. They were spinning three completely different, conflicting narratives at the exact same time. It is pathetic. It was completely pathetic, Julian said, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his face turning entirely serious. But they made one fatal, catastrophic miscalculation in their grand master plan. They assumed nobody in that giant ballroom actually knew you. They assumed you were just the invisible, nerdy tech guy they could easily erase from the narrative without any pushback. They thought you had zero value in a room full of millionaires. But they forgot who they were dealing with. They forgot about your actual, tangible reputation in the cybersecurity industry. They forgot that real power doesn't always wear a flashy suit or brag about its bank account. Julian paused, taking another long drink, letting the silence build. The fire pit crackled loudly, a shower of orange sparks floating up into the dark sky. Right before the main course of filet mignon was brought out by the army of waiters, Mr. Harrison stood up from the head table to give the traditional father of the bride toast. Julian continued, painting the picture so vividly I felt like I was standing right there in the back of the ballroom, watching the disaster unfold. The entire ballroom went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop on the polished marble floor. Harrison has that kind of intense, commanding presence. He gave a beautiful, highly polished speech about his daughter Victoria, about old-school family values, about integrity and building a legacy that lasts for generations. He talked about how the Harrisons only align themselves with people of the highest moral character. I gripped the armrests of my chair, my knuckles turning white in the cold. I knew my father. I knew Gregory was probably sitting there, nodding along, entirely convinced that Mr. Harrison was talking directly about him and his flawless, respectable family. And then, Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, heavy with anticipation, Mr. Harrison raised his crystal champagne glass and announced that he had invited a very special guest to say a few words to welcome Silas into the business world. He looked out into the crowd and introduced the CEO of Horizon Tech, Mr. Arthur Gallagher. My heart actually skipped a beat in my chest. My throat went completely dry. Gallagher, the man who signed my massive corporate paychecks. The man whose entire global enterprise network I had completely rebuilt from the ground up, single-handedly securing it against a massive, crippling international data breach just 2 years ago. I knew Gallagher was a titan of the tech industry. I knew he ran in the same elite, untouchable billionaire circles as Mr. Harrison. but I had absolutely no idea he was on the guest list for this wedding. Gallagher is there? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Oh, he was there, Julian confirmed, his eyes shining with absolute triumph. And he was about to drop a nuclear bomb right in the middle of your parents' perfect little party. Gallagher takes the microphone, looking sharp as a tack in a classic black tuxedo. Julian continued, completely captivated by his own retelling of the events. He stands in the center of the ballroom, projecting total authority. He talks about how he has known the Harrison family for decades, how they do business with honor, and how much he respects their legacy. He talks about the future of corporate partnerships and the importance of having trustworthy people in your inner circle. And then, he looks directly at your father. I held my breath, the cold Vermont air stinging my lungs. Gregory is sitting at the head table, practically beaming with unearned pride, Julian said, acting out the scene with his hands. He thinks Gallagher is about to shower Silas with praise. He thinks this is the moment the Montgomery family is officially crowned as American royalty. But Gallagher doesn't even look at Silas. He looks right at Gregory, his expression dead serious, and he says, into the microphone, his voice echoing across the entire silent ballroom, I was incredibly excited to attend tonight, not just to celebrate Victoria and Silas, but because I was hoping to finally share a drink with the man who single-handedly saved my company's digital infrastructure and protected millions of our clients from absolute ruin. I am, of course, talking about the groom's older brother, Declan Montgomery. I let out a long, slow exhale, watching my breath turn into a white cloud in the freezing air. Gallagher didn't stop there, Julian said, leaning closer. He kept going. He said, Declan is the most brilliant, high-integrity cybersecurity architect I have ever had the privilege of working with in my 30 years in this industry. He is a man of exceptional character. Where are you hiding him tonight, Gregory? I need to shake his hand and buy him a drink. I gripped the neck of my beer bottle so hard I thought the thick brown glass might actually shatter in my bare hand. He called me out by name, in front of everyone, in front of the governor and the hedge fund managers. By your full name, loud and clear with absolute reverence, Julian confirmed, laughing out loud now, a booming sound in the quiet woods. And Declan, I swear to you on my life, you should have seen your father's face. The color completely drained from his cheeks in a fraction of a second. He went from looking like a smug, conquering king to looking like a man who had just been handed a federal indictment for massive corporate fraud. His jaw actually fell open. Your mother looked like she was going to pass out face first into her expensive lobster bisque. Her eyes were wide with pure, unfiltered terror. The entire ballroom shifted their collective attention directly to your parents. The silence was deafening. It was thick enough to choke on. I could see it. I could see the exact moment their carefully constructed reality snapped in half. The very billionaires my parents were desperately trying to impress by hiding me like a shameful secret were the exact people who valued me the most. My parents worshipped status, wealth, and power above everything else in the world. And they had just publicly discovered that I held more genuine respect and influence in that room than they ever would in 100 lifetimes of social climbing. Mr. Harrison leaned over from his seat at the head table, Julian continued, the excitement practically vibrating out of him. His lapel microphone was still on, so it caught his voice perfectly. He looked at your father and said, Yes, Gregory, we've been looking for Declan all evening. Victoria tells me he wasn't even on the final seating chart. Surely that must be a terrible clerical misunderstanding? You wouldn't exclude a man of his caliber from a family event. What did Gregory do? I asked, savoring every single word. Your father tried to stammer out an excuse, Julian said, wiping a tear of genuine laughter from his eye. He mumbled something completely incoherent about a last-minute scheduling conflict and a terrible misunderstanding. He sounded like a guilty child caught stealing money from a cash register. But Mr. Harrison isn't an idiot. The man built an international real estate empire from scratch. He negotiates with sharks for a living. He can smell a liar from a mile away. You could literally see the utter, profound disgust register on Harrison's face. He put his champagne glass down on the table, gave your father a look of absolute, chilling contempt, and walked right back to his seat without saying another word. He completely dismissed Gregory in front of the entire elite class of Boston. That alone would have been enough to ruin them, I said, a slow, deep smile finally creeping onto my face, warming the cold night. Oh, but that wasn't even the grand finale, Julian said, his tone shifting to something much more intense and chaotic. The real explosion, the thing that actually burned the entire building to the absolute ground, came from Silas. I looked at Julian, genuinely shocked. Silas? What did he do? He's terrified of them. He has never stood up to Gregory in his entire life. He snapped, man. He just completely broke under the weight of it all, Julian explained, shaking his head. Silas had been throwing back straight, neat scotch since the cocktail hour. He was visibly, heavily intoxicated, and he was sitting there watching his new billionaire father-in-law publicly humiliate his parents. He watched the entire illusion of the perfect Montgomery family shatter into a million jagged pieces. The pressure was too much. When it was his turn to stand up and give the traditional groom's speech, he grabbed the microphone off the stand. He didn't even look at Victoria. He didn't look at the Harrisons. He looked directly at your parents. Julian took a deep, heavy breath, setting the scene. Silas stood there, swaying slightly, gripping the microphone so hard his knuckles were white, and he said, loudly, slurring just a bit, broadcasting to 300 people. You want to know where Declan is? I'll tell you exactly where he is. He's gone. Because my parents told him to disappear forever. They told him he wasn't good enough, wasn't rich enough, wasn't fancy enough to be here tonight. They kicked my own brother out of my wedding because they were terrified you people would judge them. They care more about their country club status than their own son. My jaw tightened. Silas actually said it. He actually told the truth. Then Silas pointed right at the extravagant floral centerpieces and the massive ice sculptures, Julian continued. And he yelled into the mic. And the funny thing is, the pathetic irony is, Declan funded this entire wedding. He paid for the flowers you're looking at. He paid for the vintage champagne you're drinking. Because I'm broke. And my parents are complete fakes. They used his money and then threw him in the trash. The silence on the porch was absolute. The cold wind rustled through the dark pine needles, but I couldn't hear it. I was stunned into complete immobility. Silas, the golden child, the boy who had never once stood up to my parents, the kid who happily took their money and their endless praise while I starved for basic affection, had completely detonated their lives on a live microphone in front of 300 of the most powerful people in the state. The ballroom went into total, absolute shock. Julian finished softly, staring into the fire. Victoria started crying immediately, covering her face with her hands. Mr. Harrison stood up, grabbed his wife's hand, and they literally walked out of the room. They just left their own daughter's reception without looking back. Half the high-profile guests, the politicians and the CEOs, followed them out the door within 5 minutes. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the Montgomery family toxicity. The wedding planner was having a literal panic attack in the corner, clutching her clipboard. Your father was screaming at Silas to shut up, his face purple with rage. Your mother was sobbing hysterically, trying to grab the microphone out of Silas's hands, while her expensive designer makeup ran down her face in thick black streaks. It was a complete, unmitigated disaster. Their social standing in Boston isn't just damaged, Declan. It is completely, permanently incinerated. They are absolute pariahs. I sat back in my chair, looking up at the dark, starless sky, processing the sheer, unimaginable magnitude of the destruction. I didn't feel the euphoric, wild thrill of victory. I didn't want to dance around the porch or cheer. Instead, I felt a deep, profound sense of final closure. The ugly, rotting truth had finally been dragged out into the bright light, kicking and screaming for the entire world to see. I thought the worst of the fallout was over. I was so incredibly wrong. The financial and legal nightmare was just about to begin. The morning after the catastrophic wedding, I woke up in the cabin as the early, Pale sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains. For the first time in my entire 32 years of life, my chest did not feel tight with chronic anxiety. The phantom weight of my family's relentless expectations, the constant, draining need to prove my worth to people who were determined to misunderstand me, had completely vanished. I made a pot of strong black coffee, sat at the small wooden dining table, and finally turned my smartphone off airplane mode. I knew there would be fallout from Silas's public meltdown. I just didn't realize how massive, vitriolic, and legally complicated it would be. Within seconds of connecting to the cellular network, my phone started vibrating violently against the wood, a relentless, buzzing stream of notifications. Dozens of voicemails, hundreds of text messages, a massive flood of urgent emails. Because I had preemptively blocked their phone numbers, the frantic text messages were filtering into my voicemail system as automated transcripts, and the emails were piling up in my spam folders. But the sheer volume was absolutely staggering. I opened my laptop, connected to the cabin's spotty Wi-Fi, and opened my email first. Aunt Beatrice had sent a message at 2 a.m., typed entirely in frantic capital letters. She called me a monster. She accused me of orchestrating a malicious, calculated plot to ruin Silas's life. She said my refusal to attend the wedding was an act of psychological warfare that caused Silas to have a severe mental breakdown on stage. It was classic Beatrice logic. Blame the victim, fiercely protect the abusers, and ignore the actual facts entirely. But the most toxic piece of correspondence came from my mother, Cynthia. Her email was an absolute masterclass in gaslighting, narcissistic deflection, and reality distortion. I read it slowly, marveling at the pure, unfiltered delusion printed on the glowing screen. She wrote, "Declan, I hope you are incredibly happy with the absolute devastation you have caused this family today. Your theatrical, childish refusal to support your brother on the most important day of his life is entirely unforgivable. We gently suggested that you might feel uncomfortable in such an elite setting, and you chose to twist our loving concern into some sort of sick, twisted victim narrative to punish us. Your brother was so distraught by your selfish absence that he drank too much and humiliated himself in front of the Harrisons. Furthermore, your erratic, deeply concerning decision to drain the family investment account without warning has left us in a terrible financial bind with the vendors. You clearly need intense psychiatric help. Transfer the funds back to the joint account immediately so we can settle the catering lawsuit, and your father and I can discuss getting you into a residential facility for your mental health." I read the words again, letting the sheer audacity wash over me. She took absolutely zero responsibility for her actions. She completely rewrote history to make herself the loving, concerned mother and me the unstable, vindictive villain. She completely glossed over the undeniable fact that she had looked me dead in the eye in that mahogany study and explicitly told me that the greatest gift I could give was to disappear forever. And best of all, she admitted in writing that they were facing a massive lawsuit because the checks they wrote to the wedding vendors were bouncing all over town since I legally took my money back. I didn't feel angry. I felt absolute, icy indifference. I didn't type out a furious reply pointing out her blatant lies. I didn't try to defend myself. Defending yourself to a narcissist is exactly like trying to teach a brick wall how to read. It is a complete waste of precious energy. I simply hit delete and permanently emptied the trash folder. I spent the next 3 days in the quiet cabin finalizing the logistics of my new life. Before the wedding drama even peaked, I had accepted a massive promotion with Horizon Tech, leveraging my excellent relationship with CEO Gallagher. I had requested a permanent transfer to their corporate headquarters on the West Coast. I was moving to Seattle, 3,000 miles away from the Boston country clubs, the fake smiles, and the suffocating legacy of the Montgomery family. A week later, my luxury condo sale closed successfully. The massive cash wire hit my private bank account, and I was sitting in a high-end airport lounge, waiting for my first-class flight to Seattle. My phone rang. It was Julian calling with the final casualty report from the Boston fallout. "You are not going to believe the absolute bloodbath happening right now in the city," Julian said, his voice crackling with excitement over the phone. "The Harrison family is playing brutal legal hardball. Victoria is staying at her parents' estate, and Mr. Harrison hired the best divorce and trust lawyers in the state. He is demanding that Silas sign an ironclad postnuptial agreement before they even consider letting him near the family trust or Victoria's inheritance. They essentially put Silas on a tight financial leash. "What about my father?" I asked, sipping my black coffee, watching the commercial planes taxi on the wet runway. "Gregory is completely drowning in his own mess," Julian replied, the satisfaction highly evident in his tone. "Remember how he was banking on landing the Harrison corporate account for his law firm? Yeah, Mr. Harrison completely blacklisted him. Not only did he pull his own business, but he made a few phone calls to his friends on the board of directors across the city. 3 other major corporate clients dropped your dad's firm this week. Harrison basically told the entire country club circuit that Gregory is a man with zero integrity who treats his own blood like garbage to climb the social ladder. In their elite world, reputation is absolute currency, and your dad's currency is completely worthless right now. He's a total pariah." "And the money?" I pressed, wanting to know exactly how hard the financial reality hit them. "The high-end caterers, the florists, and the luxury hotel venue all filed massive lawsuits when the final payment checks bounced," Julian said. "Because you legally withdrew your own documented funds, there was no joint money left. Your parents had to take out a massive second mortgage on that perfect suburban house just to cover the wedding debts and avoid being dragged into civil court. They are literally paying astronomical interest on a party that completely destroyed their lives." I looked out the massive glass windows of the terminal. My parents had proudly sacrificed their oldest son on the altar of social climbing, and the gods of high society had rejected their offering and burned their temple to the ground. It was the purest form of karma I had ever witnessed. "Thanks for the update, Julian," I said softly, feeling a genuine, peaceful smile cross my face. "But I think I'm officially done hearing about them. I have a flight to catch. I'll call you when I land in Washington." I hung up the phone, picked up my leather carry-on bag, and walked toward the gate. For the first time in 32 years, I was not Declan Montgomery, the deep disappointment. I was not Declan Montgomery, the invisible tech guy. I was just Declan, and I was finally free. Seattle was everything Boston wasn't. It was rainy, incredibly green, heavily caffeinated, and completely indifferent to social pedigree. People here didn't care what your father did for a living, what Ivy League school you attended, or what exclusive country club your family belonged to. They cared about what you could build, what complex problems you could solve, and what kind of local coffee you drank. I threw myself entirely into my new role as the director of cybersecurity at Horizon Tech. Without the constant, draining background noise of my family's heavy criticism and my mother's passive-aggressive text messages, my career absolutely exploded. I was leading a massive team of 50 brilliant engineers, designing complex security systems that protected millions of users worldwide. The salary was astronomical, but the real reward was the profound respect I received from my peers. I bought a modern, industrial loft-style apartment overlooking the dark waters of the Puget Sound. I decorated it exactly how I wanted, without a single thought about what Cynthia would think of the aesthetic. I had exposed brick walls, dark leather furniture, and massive steel shelves lined with books, vintage tech hardware, and vinyl records. It wasn't designed to impress anyone holding a glass of champagne. It was designed to be my personal sanctuary. It was during my 3rd month in Seattle that I met Harper. She was a freelance architectural photographer who was hired by the firm to take corporate headshots for our new website. When she walked into my office, she didn't look at my impressive title on the door or the expensive watch on my wrist. She looked at the chaotic stack of vintage motherboards I was tinkering with on my desk, laughed a genuine, warm laugh, and asked if I was building a time machine. Our first date was at a small, dimly lit, hole-in-the-wall ramen shop in Capitol Hill. We sat in a corner booth and talked for 4 straight hours. I didn't have to pretend to be a polished corporate drone. I didn't have to hide my geeky passions or monitor my tone. Harper was incredibly grounded, fiercely independent, and radiated a kind of genuine warmth I had never experienced in my entire life. When we started dating seriously, she naturally noticed the massive void where my family should have been. There were no holiday phone calls, no framed pictures of parents on my mantle, no stories about childhood Thanksgiving dinners. One rainy Sunday morning, as we were drinking coffee on my balcony, watching the giant ferries cross the water, I finally told her everything. I told her about the science fair trophy rotting in the closet. I told her about the white Rolls-Royce, the engagement party, and the agonizing, humiliating conversation in the mahogany study. I told her about the wedding sabotage, the withdrawal of my funds, and the epic legal fallout. I braced myself for the usual pity, or worse, the judgment that I was a cold-hearted son who cruelly abandoned his family over a petty slight. Harper just set her ceramic coffee mug down, reached across the small metal table, and took my hand. She didn't offer toxic positivity. She didn't tell me that family is family. She looked me right in the eyes and said, "Declan, surviving a toxic family doesn't make you cold. It makes you a warrior. They asked you to disappear so they could shine, and instead you finally showed up for yourself. I am so incredibly proud of you for walking away." I actually broke down. Just a few tears, silent and heavy, falling onto the wooden table. It was the first time in my entire life someone had validated my pain without making me feel weak or dramatic for carrying it. With Harper's gentle encouragement, I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Thorne. He was a seasoned specialist in narcissistic family abuse and family trauma. Sitting in his quiet office week after week, I unpacked 3 decades of severe psychological damage. Dr. Thorne helped me understand the brutal mechanics of the golden child and scapegoat dynamic. He explained that my parents' behavior wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was a reflection of their profound insecurity, their obsession with status, and their own emotional emptiness. They used Silas as a shiny trophy to impress the world, and they used me as an emotional punching bag to manage their own fragile egos and offload their extreme anxiety. "You didn't lose a family, Declan," Dr. Thorne told me during one massive breakthrough session. "You escaped a cult. The grief you feel right now isn't for the parents you actually had. It is profound grief for the loving, supportive parents you deserved but never got. You have to mourn the fantasy of the perfect Montgomery family so you can finally live in reality." That realization changed absolutely everything. I stopped waiting for the phantom apology that would magically heal my childhood. I stopped feeling guilty for protecting my hard-earned peace. I started living entirely in the present. Then, exactly 1 year and 2 months after the catastrophic wedding, the physical letters arrived. I checked my P.O. box one Tuesday afternoon and found 2 thick, heavy envelopes forwarded from my old Boston address. The handwriting on the first one belonged to Silas. The second was the sharp, aggressive, unmistakable cursive of my father, Gregory. My heart hammered in my chest. I took them back to my loft, poured a generous glass of expensive whiskey, and sat on the leather couch with Harper sitting right beside me for support. I opened Silas's letter first, tearing the envelope open carefully. "Declan, I don't know if you will ever read this, or if you just throw my mail in the trash, but I have to try. I am so incredibly sorry. I am sorry for being a coward my entire life. I am sorry for watching them tear you down for years and doing absolutely nothing to stop it because I was terrified of losing my spot on the pedestal. The wedding was an absolute nightmare, but it woke me up. Victoria and I are in intense couples counseling. I am trying to figure out who I actually am when I'm not performing for Mom and Dad. You were the only one who ever had any real integrity in that house. I miss my big brother. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. No pressure. I love you, Silas." I passed the letter to Harper. It was a good start. It showed genuine remorse and self-awareness. Then, my hands shaking slightly, I opened the letter from my father. It was written on his heavy, expensive law firm stationery, but the tone was entirely different from the arrogant, commanding man I knew. "Declan, a man spends his entire life building an empire, only to realize in his twilight years that he used the wrong bricks and built it on quicksand. The fallout from the wedding was severe, but the massive financial and social losses pale in comparison to the deafening silence of your absence. Mr. Harrison was right about me. I am a fool. I prioritized the shallow opinions of wealthy strangers over the loyalty and love of my own son. Your mother flatly refuses to admit any wrongdoing, blaming everyone else for our ruin, and the strain has fractured our marriage beyond repair. We are currently living in separate wings of the house, preparing for a quiet divorce. The house is being sold to cover the remaining debts. I am completely broken, Declan. I failed you as a father. I failed to protect you. I failed to see the incredible man you became. I am coming to Chicago next month for a legal seminar. If you can find it in your heart, I would be honored to buy you a cup of coffee. I expect nothing. I demand nothing. I just want to look my son in the eye and apologize. Gregory. I stared at the heavy blue ink on the page. The mighty Gregory Montgomery, the man who used to terrify me with a single disappointed glance, was completely broken, facing a miserable divorce, selling the family home to avoid bankruptcy, and begging his scapegoat son for a simple cup of coffee. "What are you going to do?" Harper asked softly, rubbing my shoulder. I folded the letters carefully and placed them on the coffee table. "I'm going to Chicago. It's time to finally close the book and set the boundary permanently." The coffee shop in downtown Chicago was perfectly neutral territory. It was raining heavily outside, a cold, biting Midwestern drizzle that matched the gravity of the morning. I walked through the glass doors, shaking the water from my umbrella. I was wearing a simple, comfortable sweater and dark jeans. I wasn't dressing in a tailored suit to impress anyone anymore. I had nothing left to prove. I saw them sitting at a corner booth near the back. Silas and Gregory. My father looked like he had aged 10 arduous years in the span of 14 short months. His perfectly styled hair was completely white and thinning. His broad shoulders were slumped forward in defeat, and the sharp, predatory gleam in his eyes had been entirely replaced by a hollow, tired sadness. Silas looked incredibly nervous, aggressively fidgeting with his cardboard coffee sleeve, looking more like a lost teenager than a married man of high society. I walked over slowly, my heart beating at a steady, calm rhythm, and slid into the booth opposite them. There were no hugs, no warm greetings, just a heavy, loaded, incredibly awkward silence. "Declan?" My father breathed, his voice cracking slightly, a sound I had never heard him make before. "Thank you. Thank you so much for coming." "I'm here to listen," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of emotion. "You have exactly 10 minutes. Make them count." Gregory swallowed hard. He didn't try to lawyer his way out of it. He didn't offer long-winded excuses about the stress of his job, the pressure from my mother, or the social expectations of the Harrisons. He looked me directly in the eye, tears brimming in his own, and delivered a raw, completely unvarnished apology. He admitted that he had been a terrible, neglectful father. He admitted that telling me to disappear from the family was the greatest moral failure of his entire life. He told me that my mother, Cynthia, was completely unrepentant, fiercely blaming everyone else for the impending divorce and their social exile. He confessed that losing his reputation and his family had finally made him realize how deeply toxic their shared delusion of perfection had been. Silas spoke next. His voice shook. He apologized for his lifelong complicity, for being the golden boy who eagerly soaked up the praise, the money, and the attention while watching his brother starve for basic affection. He told me he had finally quit the cushy marketing job my parents got him through networking, and was starting over at the bottom, trying to build a career on his own actual merits. I sat there, listening to the two men who had caused me so much profound agony. A younger version of me, the desperate, people-pleasing Declan, would have immediately forgiven them. He would have eagerly jumped right back into the toxic family dynamic, thrilled to finally have a tiny scrap of validation from his father. But that Declan died the night I threw my brass keys on the mahogany desk. "I appreciate the apologies," I said slowly, looking between them, my expression completely neutral. "I really do. I believe that you are both genuinely sorry. And for my own mental peace of mind, I forgive you." My father let out a shaky, desperate breath, a small, pathetic glimmer of hope appearing in his tired eyes. "So, we can start over, Declan?" We can try to be a real family again." "No," I said firmly, shattering that fragile hope instantly. Gregory froze, his mouth slightly open. Silas looked down at the wooden table, nodding slowly as if he expected this exact answer. "Forgiveness does not mean access," I explained, my voice calm but laced with absolute, unbreakable steel. "I forgive you so I don't have to carry the poison of resentment in my chest anymore. I forgive you so I can sleep at night, but I am not going to let you back into my life. The trust is completely gone. You showed me exactly who you are when the pressure was on. You chose a white Rolls-Royce, a country club membership, and the approval of billionaires over my basic humanity. You only recognize my value now because your elite social circle punished you for throwing me away." "Declan, please," my father whispered, a single tear escaping and rolling down his wrinkled cheek. "I'm your father. I'm an old, broken man. I don't want to die knowing my oldest son hates me." "I don't hate you, Gregory," I said. It was the first time I had ever called him by his first name, and I saw him flinch. "I just don't need you anymore. I have built a beautiful, peaceful life. I have a woman who loves me for exactly who I am, without requiring a resume. I have friends who are my real family. I am not going to jeopardize my hard-earned peace to help you manage your suffocating guilt." I looked at Silas, softening my gaze just a fraction. "Keep going to therapy, Silas. Build your own life outside of their shadow. Maybe, years down the road, if you prove you are a fundamentally different man, we can have a beer as adults. But right now, my door is closed." I stood up from the booth. I didn't feel angry. I felt incredibly light, as if a massive, heavy anchor had been lifted off my spine. I looked down at my father one last time. "You told me the greatest gift I could give the family was to disappear," I said softly, making sure he heard every word. "I gave you exactly what you asked for. You just didn't realize that in disappearing from your lives, I finally appeared in my own." I turned and walked out of the coffee shop, stepping out into the cold Chicago rain. I opened my umbrella and walked down the busy street. I didn't look back once. Later that evening, I stood on the balcony of my hotel room, Harper standing beside me, her arms wrapped tightly around my waist, her head resting on my shoulder. We looked out at the glittering, sprawling city skyline. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the crisp air. The agonizing saga was officially over. The heavy, suffocating ghost of the Montgomery family legacy no longer haunted my every move. I was the architect of my own destiny now, and the foundation I had built for myself was completely indestructible. Sometimes, walking away is not an act of defeat or cowardice. Sometimes, cutting the ties to the toxic people who happen to share your blood is the ultimate, most powerful act of self-love. You do not owe your sanity, your finances, or your soul to people who only love you when you are convenient for their fake narrative. You have the absolute right to pack your bags, take your money, and build an empire of your own on a foundation of genuine love and respect. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to walk away from toxic parents or siblings to save yourself and protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.